When it comes to Italian battleships, they can, broadly speaking, fit into two categories. The big and famous ships, like the Littorios and Cesare, or they fall into a lesser known category, such as Cavour. In today's video, we'll be looking at another of the latter category, the battleship Duilio, the last of Italy's traditional dreadnoughts. Although the name of the ship does vary on who you ask. Is it Caio Duilio or just Duilio? From what I've seen, the ship is formally known as Duilio, in contrast to later ships with the same name. Either way, this was a ship with a quiet life, especially during the Great War. Where Duilio stands out from the pack, as it were, is Taranto. One of the ships damaged during that raid, the ship would be raised and pressed back into service. In this regard, she did better than Cavour. And she would, in the end, outlive every other Italian battleship, aside from her own sister, Andrea Doria. Not a bad run, even if it wasn't the most eventful out there. It's also a story that lasted for 40 years in the end. A story that began on February 24th, 1912. In the Royal Shipyard in Naples, a new battleship began to take shape. The second of the Andrea Doria-class, although this new ship was laid down first. As a result, you'll often see the class referred to as the Duilio-class instead. Regardless of your stance on that topic, the construction of this ship went without real issue. Duilio would launch on April 24th, 1913. Even the fitting out lacked the same issues that faced other Italian ships. There was no major delay waiting on guns or armor. Waiting on guns was a major issue for her sister ship, as Andrea Doria had her weaponry looted to finish Cavour's construction. Duilio would suffer no such problems, and the ship actually completed ahead of schedule. She was projected for a June 30th, 1915 commissioning. Instead, Duilio would begin her sea trials a couple months early, and she would join the Regia Marina on May 10th, 1915. This was at the height of the Great War, the same month that Italy declared war. The Italians declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 23rd, 1915. However, that would end up being a less than eventful time at war for this ship. We'll get to that, but before we do, a quick detour to the design, as is tradition. In this case, it was a fairly typical dreadnought. Duilio was, at her core, a very similar design to the preceding Cavour. There were some changes to the structure, a shortening of the forecastle deck being the main one. Along with this change, the Italians also lowered the amidships turret. If you look at the ships from the side, this is very apparent. The other notable change came in the secondary battery, as we'll see later on. First, however, we have the displacement. On Duilio, this came out to around 23,000 tons at the standard loading, going up to 25,200 tons when fully loaded. That displacement allowed the ship to carry 5 turrets, all on the center line, a pair superfiring on the bow, and a pair superfiring on the stern, with a 5th turret directly amidships between the funnels. The superfiring pairs featured a twin turret mounted above a triple, with the amidships mount being a 3rd triple turret. Each of these turrets carried 305mm or 12-inch guns, coming out to 13 barrels in all. These were backed up by 16 152mm or 6-inch secondary guns, carried in single casement mountings clustered around the superfiring turrets. This can be compared to Cavour, which carried 18 120mm 4.7-inch guns. That's where the difference in secondary battery comes into play. The weaponry past that point was rounded off by 19 single 76mm guns, spread around the deck and atop the turrets for anti-torpedo boat use. And finally, the ship also carried the traditional submerged torpedo tubes. 3 tubes in this case, with 1 in the stern, and 1 on either broadside. All of this was protected by a main belt of 250 millimeters, or 9.8 inches in thickness. The deck, for its part, consisted of 2 armored decks, a 24 millimeter thick main deck, and a 29 millimeter thick second deck. Now, to round off the design, we have speed. This came out to 21 knots on 30,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Fairly typical for this time period. And with that, we're done with the design details. At least for now. We'll be coming back to this a bit later. For the moment, back to service. As is typical with Italian dreadnoughts, this began with little fanfare. The Regia Marina was very insistent on keeping their new ships at home during the Great War. The Adriatic was, rightfully, seen as a very risky place to fight. Plenty of room for torpedo boats or submarines to ambush a lumbering dreadnought. This means that Duilio remained in port for most of the war. Only a handful of short patrols to keep the crew sharp, with the result that the ship was still in port when the war ended in 1918. As things shifted to the interwar years, not much really changed for Duilio. She simply moved from sitting at home to showing the flag, and supporting Italian interests without actually firing her guns in anger. For example, the ship left Italy for Turkey in 1919. Specifically, she was sent to Smyrna on April 26th of 1919. There were some touchy arguments about that part of Turkey. Too touchy to really get into here. In simplest terms, the Allied powers couldn't quite agree on who would occupy it. Italy, Turkey, or Greece. In the end, the Greeks landed troops and occupied the city in May 1919, and Duilio would sail on to the Black Sea to support the White Russians in their civil war. That would last from June 23rd to July 13th, although it didn't come to much. Duilio had little to do, and the Reds would win the Civil War. The rest of 1919 passed quietly, with the ship back in Italy. When 1920 rolled around, however, things got a bit more exciting, most notably in the Corfu incident in 1923. This involved the murder of an Italian general and 4 others, and prompted an Italian occupation of the island. Most of the active Italian warships were present, from Duilio to Cesare. Of course, other than bombarding some shoreline, there was little to actually do. So it's more exciting than her previous service, but not by much. The rest of the early 1920s was spent on various port visits, be it Turkey in 1921 or Spain in 1923. Nothing of major note until Duilio suffered an internal explosion on April 8, 1925. This was traced to faulty cordite in the third turret's lift and caused substantial damage. Not crippling, and the ship was at no risk of sinking. Nonetheless, Duilio would be in for repair and refit for a couple years. The ship put into dock at La Spezia and only returned to service in April of 1928 for a certain value of service. The ship had no more major incidents for the rest of her pre-rebuild career. Duilio would serve on training and patrol duty from 1928 to 1930. Then she would receive a short refit from March to June 1930, at which point the ship returned to the same quiet work, until ultimately entering into reserve on August 11th, 1932, all of which follows the general pattern of these Italian dreadnoughts. The worsening economic situation due to the Great Depression left Italy with little choice. They had issues manning and maintaining the ships on active duty. As direct result, Duilio, now flagship of the reserve fleet, would remain in reserve for several years. While Italy warred with Ethiopia in 1936, the ship remained home. Whitley cites the unmodernized Doria and Duilio as unfit for frontline duty, to directly quote, and would only have been employed as floating batteries. Italian battleships doesn't go quite as far, but even then, the ships were seen as having a near-zero combat value, unable to operate with either the modernized Cavours or the new Littorios. All of this means we've reached the controversial stage of this ship's history, the massive rebuild turning her into basically a new, although small, battleship. Building upon the previous Cavour rebuilds, they improved on the process in Doria and Duilio. In Duilio's case, the modernization began on April 1st, 1937. This consisted of two major focuses: improving the speed and improving the weaponry. Armor protection largely remained the same, at least when it came to the main belt. To increase speed, the whole form of the ship changed, quite drastically in fact. Building off the experience with Cavour, Duilio would have her old bow lopped off a bit ahead of the forward turret. This was replaced by a new, far more aggressive bow. This increased the length from 176 meters, 577 feet, to 187 meters, or 613 feet. On Cavour, the similar new bow had just been grafted over the old one. That caused issue with water leaking through the joints between the old and new structure. This wasn't as much of an issue on Doria or Duilio. Beyond that change, the battleship also lost the amidships turret. This was replaced by a new machinery space, increasing power from 30,000 shaft horsepower all the way up to 75,000. Although the ship lost 2 shafts, leaving her with only 2 after the refit. All of this work increased the speed to around 26 knots, which was a 5-knot increase. No mean feat, really, although the ships were still at the slower end for a fast battleship. Now for weaponry. The main battery saw the same change as done on Cavour. As said, the amidships turret was removed. The remaining 4 turrets, meanwhile, saw their guns bored out, from 305mm 12 inches to 320mm or 12.6 inches. There have been arguments this made the guns less accurate, although how bad this was is debated. In any event, the bigger change came to the secondary battery. The old casements were torn out, replaced by 4 triple mounts, each carrying 3 135mm 5.3-inch guns. These were in 2 super firing pairs on either side of the bridge. Behind those, the rest of the secondary battery was fitted. 10 90mm guns in single mountings, 5 on either side of the ship. These were supported in turn by 15 37mm and 12 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Armor protection, as I said, remained largely the same. The belt saw no major changes. The deck armor, on the other hand, was improved to either 135mm or 150mm, depending on the source. Furthermore, the ship was also fitted with the Puglisi torpedo defense system, which, in simplest terms, consisted of a large cylinder that was designed to crumple and absorb the impact of a torpedo, or other underwater damage. With that, we've reached the end of the notable changes. Other modifications were largely to the superstructure, which came out looking a bit like the Littorio in miniature, other than the weird conning tower on top of the bow superfiring turret. That aside, we can return to the service history now. For Duilio, this saw her rebuild conclude on July 15, 1940. This was, of course, after Italy had joined the Second World War on June 10th. However, Duilio would not initially see much service. First, of course, came training and working up the crew. This lasted until late August 1940, with the result that Duilio's first war patrol came on August 31st. This saw the battleship sail as an attempt to intercept a British convoy to Malta. As was typical of early Mediterranean combat, this came to nothing. The Italian fleet was unable to spot the British between foul weather and lack of proper air support. As such, the fleet returned to Taranto the next day. Duilio would sail again on September 7th, a week later, to try and engage the British. However, this time, faulty intelligence would keep her from doing so. The British, Force H to be specific, were off Dakar, well away from any Italian warships. Although it was more a mix of faulty intel and the British deliberately misleading the Italians. Either way, Duilio returned to port, and she would remain there until November 1940, when, well, her most famous action took place. That, of course, being the attack on Taranto on November 11th, 1940. Duilio would be hit with one torpedo on her starboard side, pretty much exactly beneath her bow turrets. This torpedo detonated beneath the ship, causing far more damage than a side hit would have done. Moreover, it was outside the area protected by the Puglisi system. As a result, the ship suffered severe flooding. Fortunately for Duilio, other ships helped to beach the battleship in shallow water. This would make raising her relatively easy. The repair work still took until January 1941, at which point the ship sailed to Genoa for proper repairs, arriving on January 26th. Duilio would be in dock for those repairs until May, returning to Taranto on May 16, 1941. However, the rest of her war service would be about as quiet as the initial service had been. Duilio would sortie at several points in attempts to either engage the British or escort Italian convoys. For example, covering a convoy to North Africa on November 29th, or covering another on December 13th. This attempt did not go particularly well. British deception convinced the Italians that the Royal Navy was in the area, prompting a withdrawal, during which Vittorio Veneto was torpedoed by HMS Urge. Duilio's next action came on December 17th with the First Battle of Sirte. However, the battleship was too far away to actually participate in the battle. Not that it was a particularly conclusive one either way. Early 1942 wasn't much more exciting in this regard. Duilio would escort a couple convoys in January, and then attempt to engage a British convoy on February 14th. That would be her last offensive action, while Duilio would escort another Italian convoy on February 21st. The fuel situation for Italy was becoming critical. As a result, the ship was basically decommissioned after that last convoy. She would remain in Taranto until the Italian surrender in 1943, barring a couple training voyages in 1942 and refits in 1943. When the Italians did surrender on September 8, 1943, Duilio sailed to Malta. The battleship would be interned there until June 1944. However, even after returning to Italy, the ship mostly spent her time in refit or swapping between Italian ports. Although in the end the ship did survive the war. Duilio would, alongside Andrea Doria, be one of two battleships left to Italy. Cesare was sent to the Soviets, and the Littorios, along with the capsized hulk of Cavour, were scrapped. While Doria would have a long career, Duilio wouldn't last as long. The ship saw active duty as flagship from 1947 until November of 1950, at which point the ship was put in reserve at Taranto until 1953. Duilio was then formally decommissioned and moved to La Spezia, where she remained until being stricken from service on September 15, 1956, and subsequently scrapped the following year. Not the most exciting of ends, but then Duilio had a mostly quiet life in general, for better or worse. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.